What you're seeing right now is my character attacking a Godric soldier on 2 separate occasions. This is the same character attacking the same enemy with the same weapon and the same move, a single R1. And yet, you can clearly see that the attack on the left did less damage than the attack on the right. Very clearly, there is something going on, and this something can be identified with this flash of white light here. This is a sign that we are taking advantage of a special mechanic that gives us more damage. To be more specific, this is a sign that we are taking advantage of counter damage. So now we have to ask ourselves, what is counter damage? How does it work? And, most importantly, how can we abuse it? Let's get started. We can define counter damage as an internal mechanic in Elden Ring that affects both the enemies and the player. It increases the power of pierce-type damage when an entity is hit during the active frames of their attack. It is important to understand that we can deal counter damage to enemies, and enemies can deal counter damage to us. Let's unpack this. The first thing to note is that this mechanic only works with pierce-type damage. As such, no other damage is affected by this mechanic. To make things clear, standard, slashing, and strike-type physical damage cannot get counter damage. In the same way, all elemental damage types, magic, fire, lightning, and holy, are also not capable of getting additional counter damage. It is just pierce-type damage. That being said, this is not locked behind weapon types. We do not look at the weapon when it comes to counter damage. We only look at the damage types. This means that there are weapons that will have access to counter damage with certain moves only, but not all of them. The easiest example is a longsword. A longsword R1 deals standard type damage, and as we saw, this means that it cannot take advantage of counter damage. On the other hand, a longsword R2 is a fantastic poke and it deals pierce type damage. This means that this attack will be able to deal counter damage if done at the right time. Remember, it is not about the weapon, it is about the type of damage. The other condition is timing. We can only get counter damage if we attack an enemy at the right time. As mentioned before, we have to attack an enemy during the active frames of their attack. Every attack in the game has startup frames, active frames, and recovery frames. The startup is the preparation of the attack. The active part is when the attack will deal damage, and the recovery is when your character is returning to a neutral position. Every attack in the game has these frames, but they all have it at different moments of the animation. Some attacks are faster, others are slower, some recover quicker, and some others take a bit more time. It is all about identifying what each part of the attack is and hitting the enemy at the right moment. While I do understand that this might be difficult to do, it is all a matter of practice. The general rule of thumb is as follows. If the attack is at the part that can hurt our character, then we can deal counter damage to that enemy. If we are able to correctly meet these conditions, then our character will receive the reward of counter damage. Obviously, this is an increase of damage dealt to the enemy with an attack. That being said, it is important to note that the actual amount of damage that we get from counter damage varies depending on whether we are attacking a PvE enemy or if we are attacking another player. That's right, counter damage is calculated differently in these situations, and that counts us as players too. Even if we are playing solo in PvE, the amount of counter damage that we receive is different from the amount that enemies will receive. When it comes to counter damage against PvE enemies, it will always be the same no matter which one we hit. In PvE, the increase of damage is 30%. On your screen, you will see the results of my testing with 3 different weapons that will certify this total damage increase. I attacked the Godric soldier with a halberd, with a short spear, and with the R2 of a Lordsorn straight-sword. You can see the damage values on a standard hit and on a counter hit, which gives us the additional counter damage. The test results shows us that there is a 28.4% damage increase for the halberd, a 30.7% increase for the short spear, and a 29.9% increase for the Lordsworn Straight-Sword. The variations that you see are due to the different AR values and the rounding that the game does when it calculates damage. Nevertheless, you can see that all values are approximate to this 30% mark. The biggest value for PvE counter damage is the fact that it is extremely consistent. If you are able to time your attacks correctly each time, you will always get this 30% additional damage. This is a huge increase and it provides a fantastic boost to our DPS. While it does take some practice to get used to it, the fact of the matter is that the total damage value that we get from this mechanic is simply incredible. It can turn a 4-hit kill into a 3-hit, or a 3-hit kill into a 2-shot. It provides efficiency and speed. Any player that decides to put time into practicing this technique will find themselves defeating all enemies in the game in a very quick fashion. Now, if we are dealing with player characters, things are a bit different. The first thing to understand is that the following rules only apply to the counter damage done to a player. This means PvP when players are attacking each other, but it also means PvE when an enemy attacks us. In these cases, counter damage is not based on an increase to total damage. Instead, it materializes as a decrease of the target's pierce type negation. To be clear, we still get extra damage, but not because our power is increased. Instead, because our target's defenses are lowered. In this way, the damage calculation is done with the lowered negation and the target will take that additional damage. The general rule is that when a player is in the active frames of their attack, their pierce type negation will be reduced by 15%. That being said, this 15% reduction is not a flat value. It is considered to be an additional negation value that will be taken into consideration alongside all armor pieces that you're using. This of course means that the higher your pierce type negation is, the less of a decrease you will suffer. On your screen, you have been seeing the examples. First, at the top, when our character is wearing no armor and has 0% negation, you will see the full 15% reduction during the active frames. This is the evidence of the general rule. We lose 15% pierce negation. Now, if you move on to the middle, to a character using some medium armor and sitting at 20% negation, the reduction is less. In this case, we go from 20% pierce negation to 8% pierce negation. This represents a 12% decrease. As you can see, wearing some armor already makes counter hits less dangerous to our character. And finally, if we were to use some heavy armor and be at 43% pierce type negation, you will see that at the bottom we go from 43% pierce negation to 35% pierce negation. This is an 8% drop. It is almost half of the initial 15% that the general rule applies to our character. The conclusion is obvious. The more protective armor we use, the less of an effect counter damage will have on our character. For this mechanic, more protective heavy armor has a definitive advantage. Player characters will suffer this decrease in pierce type negation during the active frames of all attacks, including jump attacks, as well as during the active frames of Ashes of War and even some spells. When it comes to spell casting, some sorceries and miracles generated the counter hit window, for example, Discus of Light or the Dragon Claw, while others, on the other hand, did not, for example, the Lightning Spear or the Stone of Gorank. So, while it is safe to say that all attacks will make you more vulnerable, spells should be taken into consideration on a case-by-case basis. Make sure to double-check your favorite spells. Finally, I want to give you a single word of warning. Do not underestimate player counter damage. Sure, it is only 15%, and yes, we can even reduce it further by wearing heavier armor. That said, when it comes to the damage calculations of a player, even that simple 8% can be very dangerous. When a player is attacked during their active frames, the game already takes into consideration the lowered and lessened pierce negation for the purposes of damage calculations. This means that immediately your character will be weaker at the point of impact. Why is this so important? Well, if the other players or the enemies you're fighting have any other buffs active or any other conditions that support them, these bonuses will very quickly stack together with the lowered defenses of the target. The result is massive damage, and you should never ignore it. Do not let your guard down. Counter damage is dangerous. As you have seen, counter damage is a very simple mechanic to understand. The problem is that the game does not explain it anywhere, and it is up to the player to discover it and explore it. On the other hand, counter damage is not easy to use. Timing your attacks so that they always hit your enemies during their active frames can be difficult. Different attacks have different timings. Some are obvious, but others not so much. That being said, the additional damage is 100% worth the effort. There are things that we can do to make this easier, like poking from behind the shield or simply trading hits with the enemy by stacking poise. There are some risks, but as mentioned, the reward is definitely worth it. It is my full recommendation that you try your best to take advantage of this mechanic. It is extra damage, and after all, everyone loves extra damage. Thank you very much for your time, and I hope that I get to see you on the next one.